Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the Kremmina front, where there has yet again been additional advancements by the Russians, this time in the direction of Terny, as we see the forested areas here to the east of Terny is being attacked by Russian soldiers advancing through the areas bit by bit, but they are advancing through to get closer and closer to the villages and the Serbets River. We're seeing that we're getting closer and closer to a future Russian offensive in this section of the front line, which will likely be focused around Terny, as there is this northern flank that the Russians can go through with hardly any forest areas, and if they've managed to advance through the forest areas and gain footholds with their assault groups, then they'll be able to support such an armored assault by simply having their presence in the forest areas and dealing with any of the Ukrainian anti-tank units in the area. So we're seeing that there is this constant effort by the Russians through the forest areas where they've gotten a foothold in this one connected to Novomykhailivka, and they've advanced halfway through the one connected to Terny. And with this, we see that there's constant efforts by the Russians to get closer and closer to launch a future offensive to the east of the Serbets River. We see that they're very close to everywhere across the front line within a kilometer's distance, and therefore the Russians are now very close to such a potential offensive in the direction of the Serbets River. We then move on in a southern direction towards Avdiivka, where we see significant fighting take place yet another day. We start out in the northern parts of the city where there has been multiple Russian advancements. First off, in the direction of the Dacha area, the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within it and are now advancing within it towards the coke plant. So the Russians are here generally, as we see it, a bit to the south of that, advancing in the direction of the railways that goes through the center of Avdiivka. Goes through here all the way to the center of the city where the rail station is, as well as to the south of it. So with this, we see that there is an advancement by the Russians in the direction of this railway and setting that as a front line. And while having that as a front line and the flank of the Russians, they are advancing in a southern direction towards the center of the city. So what we can see is that the Russians are actually storming the center of the city towards the railway station, as well as the central residential areas to the north of the citadel area. Citadel area is this area located here to the southwest of the city, where the Ukrainians have heavy fortifications and high-rise buildings, where they have focused a lot of their forces to deal with any Russian attempts at the city from the west. This is why we have seen no assaults by the Russians from a western direction towards the city, due to this citadel area acting as a very heavily fortified outpost for the Ukrainians here in the central parts of the city. We're seeing a lot of fighting to the south and to the north of it, but nothing towards it itself. There's this sort of range around it where no one has gotten inside of. We do, however, see the Russians getting closer and closer from the south as they move up through the residential area. But if the Russians are going to start attacking the citadel area, they'll need to consolidate the southern parts of Avdiivka, where they need to capture the Ukrainian fortified positions to the south of the citadel area, as well as to the southeast of the city itself and the forest area. This is all to protect the flanks of the Russian soldiers if they want to attack the citadel area, because if they dedicate their assault groups and their strength towards the citadel area, they'll be left vulnerable in the other areas unless they have simply too many soldiers and enough soldiers to hold all of the gaps. But this still leaves the weakness that, for example, here by Sarka-Ohota, there's a few fortifications, but the only real area where fighting is just a deciding factor is the Sarka-Ohota area. If the Ukrainians recapture it, then the main supply route in and out of the southern parts of the residential area for the Russians would be left in Ukrainian hands, and the Russians would be cut off. This is why they need to expand into this central area. And at the same time, the Ukrainians can launch operations through the forest area and attack the Russian supply line from the west. This is why they need the fortifications here to the west. So all of this is to strengthen the Russian hold of the residential area here to the south of the city. We can say that the area here to the north where the Russians made this breakthrough and have since then just constantly advanced would never have taken place if the Russians didn't already have a foothold here to the south of the city. The main reason for that is as soon as this push happened and the Russians got control over the residential area, the Ukrainians constantly launched counterattacks and concentrated a lot of their forces to the south to regain some of the lost positions. This left the northern parts vulnerable until additional reinforcements arrived, and in this span of time the Russians launched this assault and got a foothold. Now they're moving towards the railways and the railway station, which, by the way, is a very heavily fortified area because these sort of stations, the infrastructure and the way that the buildings were built can handle so much more than the normal residential buildings. Therefore, the Russians will likely look to storm the train station here to the south of the currently held positions. So they'll move by the railways down to the railway station and then cross over the railways towards the central parts of it and then cut off the Ukrainian supply line there and move upwards. So that is what we're currently seeing. The Russians are moving in a southern direction as they're storming the central parts of the city. They'll likely reach the center of the city, which is here by the railway station, before moving down south and cutting off the main supply route. So the advancements here in the northern parts of the city, as we can see, all move in a southern direction. The Russians are likely looking to gain control over the central parts of the residential area as they move through and will likely go and target the train station. If they get control over the central area and the train station, then attacks towards the citadel area can happen from the north. The attacks towards the citadel area can already happen to the south. However, it is unlikely that it will take place until the Russians have control over the flanks of the currently held Russian positions, and that would leave this central parts here to the south, which is a low-ground residential area of Avdiivka city. If the Russians manage to take the northern parts and the southern parts, then the Ukrainians would be extremely vulnerable in the central parts as they are being flanked by two sides and fighting in two sides. At the same time, all of the Ukrainian soldiers to the east would be in a very difficult situation if the Russians advance further to the south from the northern direction, which would leave all of these positions heavily vulnerable, especially if the Russians also capture the heights here to the southeast of the lake. If that happens, then all of the Ukrainian positions would be overlooked by Russian firepower and they would be extremely vulnerable. So the Ukrainians are likely forced to withdraw into the residential area of the city. However, no such withdrawal has taken place, nor has any withdrawal from the city taken place, as the Ukrainians are fighting for every single square meter of this fighting taking place within the city. So while propaganda outlets are trying to convince you that Avdiivka was never an important or significant city in the first place, that idea goes both ways. If the Russians are putting a lot into taking Avdiivka and it is strategically insignificant for the Ukrainians, then they may simply withdraw from the city, and as such they would not lose any of their soldiers in a strategically insignificant city. However, if they are staying and defending, that is because they put value into it. And if the Russians are pouring a lot of infantry in it in the first place, then it is because they see it as strategically significant. Therefore, based on how many soldiers and how much fighting is taking place over this city, it is clearly strategically significant. But besides all of that, we can also see that the proximity to the Donetsk of Avdiivka, as well as the heavy fortifications within the city, already determined that it was significant years ago. Forget about the start of the invasion. Even in the civil war, Avdiivka was very significant, and it changed hands between the pro-Russian and the Ukrainian forces here fighting through Avdiivka. This is why there's so many shell marks and the satellite imagery. We can see that there's not a single square meter. Some areas without heavy shelling. There's trenches everywhere, and all of this took place prior to the Russian invasion. So based on all of this, this city of Avdiivka is very significant, and the Russians are getting very close to capturing it with these constant advancements as they storm the center of the city. And they're getting close to the train area, which would be the most significant part, next to the citadel area and the coke plant, as they plan to cut off the supplies in and out of the city. This would leave this road here to the northeast of Severne and northwest of the citadel area as the sole supply route in and out of Avdiivka that isn't physically cut. And as we can see here, the Russians are very close to it and have direct fire control of it here to the east of Severne. And if they advance further in the northeastern direction, they could have clear area overview of the situation. as well as the supply route in and out of the city, which would mean that the Ukrainians would be forced to move through an area, a road that is very close to Russian positions, and would end up in the same way as the road between Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut in the Battle of Bakhmut, where there were tens and dozens of armored vehicles of the Ukrainians destroyed along the road as they tried to move back and forth through it to supply and resupply Bakhmut. And now we're going to see a repetition of the same if the Russians manage to gain control over the train station here to the north of the citadel area. And that is it for the Avdiivka front. We then move on to here in the direction of Nevelske, where there is this geolocated footage here to the southeast of the village of Russian soldiers moving through the area. And with this, we have confirmation that the Russians have control over this area and they are doing further operations here, which would indicate that they are moving further in the direction of Nevelske, which is in combination to the advancements here in Pervomaiske. Moving further south, we actually have two significant advancements by the Russians. The first one is here in Novomykhailivka, where the Russians have gotten a foothold within the town. This is the first one in a very long time, where previously they had a foothold here in the cemetery, as well as farmlands to the south of Novomykhailivka. Now they have a foothold within the residential area itself. This is following the armored assault, which was geolocated by Ryber, and now we're seeing Syriac maps confirming this advancement, and now we have further foothold within the town of Novomykhailivka. And this, as if on cue, happened in combination with this advancement by the Russians north of Mikhailske, east of Vuhledar. So we're seeing that there is an operation towards Vuhledar here at the same time as the Russians got a foothold within Novomykhailivka to pressure heavily the Ukrainian supplies in the area and the Ukrainian fortifications. We're seeing constant bombardments of Vuhledar, as we see in this footage here, which was geolocated to be here in Vuhledar. There is constant bombardments of the Ukrainian positions here within the town. And we also see in this footage, there is a trench that goes through the eastern parts of Vuhledar and into the Dacha area. So there's this trench connection between the two, which is why the Ukrainians were able to deal with the Russian push last year in February. And now we're seeing that yet again, they're repeating a battle over Vuhledar. It's going to be interesting to see if they repeat the mistakes of the past or if they have made up a completely new plan, combining it with the battle over Novomykhailivka. But what we're seeing is that there's renewed efforts by the Russians here in the south, and after the Battle of Avdiivka, there's definitely not going to be any silence at the front line as the fighting continues throughout the whole area, both in the Kremmina front and now in the Vuhledar section. I would likely see a restart of the Battle of Bakhmut soon enough, where the Russians will move towards the canal line or even towards Chasiv Yar. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.